So let's meet our first speaker for today. I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker who's going to be speaking for 30 minutes, and it's founder of Shodan. It's Mr. John Matherly. Welcome, John. Now, he's going to be speaking on the subject of conversation with your control system. John, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here this morning. And I'm here to talk about my experience and my journey with control systems. So, first of all, if you're not familiar with me, I am the founder and CEO of a company called Shodan. What Shodan is it's basically a giant database of all devices that are directly connected to the internet. And sometimes we generate maps like the ones you see over here on the big screen right now, which is basically everything that we see on the internet at the moment. It's a heat map, so red areas mean more devices, blue areas mean fewer devices. And nowadays we see a lot of headlines like this about how, cyber attacks are increasing across the board and the world is ending. But my journey in ICS began about 6 years ago. Okay, I need to jump back. All right, 1 second. It began 6 years ago with the research that was done by a person named Aaron Leverett. And at the time, he was a master's student at Cambridge. And what he did was use Shodan, which at that point in time only was mostly indexing web servers. And he used Shodan to find industrial control systems running web servers, so usually HMIs and whatnot. And he wrote a research paper, and he discovered, some 10,000 of them on the internet. This was big news back then, not just because, master's student at Cambridge, but more importantly that nobody believed that you could actually find control systems directly connected to the internet. People had speculated that, but it hadn't been verified yet. And as a result of his research, I started getting phone calls from people. So the first interview I had was with a person at Reuters. And he called me up, and he's like, hey, John, I just saw this research paper. I heard you're a founder of Shodan. Can you tell me a bit more about what you do, yada, yada, yada. But before that, let me ask you, are you able to make an elevator crash? And if so, can you make one crash that has people inside it? Can you tell if an elevator is full or not? And I was like, what are you talking about? I mean, this is not really related to the research at all. I don't understand the relation. Basically, the whole interview ended up being this dialogue where he was trying to find a most dramatic way of framing the story around ICS. It was just a completely mind-boggling. And the next time I did a major interview on ICS was for CNBC. So they were supposed to do a documentary with Melissa Lee on ICS in the US. So US infrastructure, how it's been changing over time, physical, cyber, all the problems we're facing, and interviewed me for a tiny segment, just, because I'm the Shodan guy. And we did an hour-and-a-half long interview, and I thought it was great. Half a year later, I get a phone call from the producer and saying, hey, John, I think we're going to change. We're going to pivot the story a bit. Can we reshoot some things? And so they send out another crew, and this time all they ask me about are webcams. And I'm a bit confused at this point, because I thought this was about ICS. And so I contact the producer, and he says, yeah, John, we did a focus group study, and it turns out that we really couldn't sell ICS to the audience. Everybody knows ICS is important, but selling it to an audience was a completely different thing, and they couldn't do it. So instead, this turned into like a 5-minute segment of Google cars and IoT and all that stuff. And there have been many talks about Shodan where they show all this crazy stuff that you can find on the internet. You can find gas stations, nuclear power plants. I mean, if it has a computer inside it, somebody's probably connected it at some point. But this is not what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to do a talk about all this crazy stuff you can find on Shodan. You can do it yourself if you just go to the website. What I want to talk about is how things have been changing. So this is just, again, sort of an overview of how we see the public perceiving ICS. So there were 2 articles. One was by the Washington Post, where they did a 5-page expose on ICS, and the other one was a CNN story the top 10 most dangerous things on the internet. It was like, a slideshow. CNN blew our website out of the water. It just took the website down. Washington Post, we didn't get much traffic at all. People don't care. Nowadays, though, we're seeing renewed interest, at least from our perspective, because of IoT, and because how IoT is being used by botnets nowadays to launch DDoS attacks of unprecedented size. This is a chart showing how the DDoS volume has changed with Mirai. Mirai is the most recent point with Internet of Things. But before I get into the ICS part of things, I'd like to provide you with a bare bones understanding of how we see Shodan, how we see the internet at Shodan. So on the left side, you see a breakdown of the most popular ports in Kuwait. And on the right side, you see compared to the world. So the world, you see a lot of web servers, as you'd expect, some voice over IP. CWMP is a protocol used by modems to update themselves. What I would like to highlight in Kuwait is that Telnet. Telnet, a protocol that has no encryption, is actually considered deprecated in the IT world, is the fifth most popular port we see in Kuwait. Something to think about. And 554, that is a video streaming port used by webcams, DVRs, things like that. So Kuwait has a bit unusual distribution in ports. Not that bad, but unusual. And we also look at IPv6, but I'm not going to talk too much about IPv6 because our view is a bit skewed right now. So, but just in case you're curious, it's a bit different in IPv6 world. A lot more web servers, a lot more DNS. And in terms of how Kuwait stands up to the rest of the world, I wanted to look at just SSL-related things, just briefly. And so Kuwait is responsible for 0.04% of the SSL web services. However, it is responsible for 0.6% of SSL supporting SSL v2. So I don't know what you're doing here in Kuwait, but slightly skewed. And then also 0.08% of Heartbleed. So you're disproportionately high in your vulnerability to both Heartbleed and running SSL v2. An interesting thing is when you look at the Heartbleed results, in Kuwait, a large number of them are actually the Fortinet firewalls. So these are people that are running firewalls by Fortinet, but they never patched them. And so the firewall is actually vulnerable to Heartbleed. Patch your things. And now let me start talking about ICS. So I'm going to be talking during this talk about ICS and IoT, because IoT is a hot topic and it's something we do a lot at Shodan. First, for ICS, after the research came out by Aaron Leverett, we got some inquiries by consulting companies saying, hey, John, you should look at this protocol called Modbus. And I'm not an ICS guy. I come from the IT world, obviously. And I started asking some of my friends, saying, hey, do you know about this Modbus thing? Can we add it to Shodan? What do you think? And the consensus at the time was, don't do it, John. Just don't do it. Because if you do it, you might accidentally crash control systems. And I thought this was kind of crazy that just connecting to them could crash them. And people consider them to be very brittle. A lot of people were worried. And so over time, I started looking into it. Yeah, I know this is an OT crowd, so I'm sorry. I hope I'm not going to offend too many people. But I started looking into it, and my observation as an IT guy was that ICS sucks. And I want to be a bit more specific about that, because really from what I looked at, it's the ICS software ecosystem that sucked. It's really not friendly to work with at all compared to the IT world. And I start off with the user interfaces. They look terrible. Like if Apple released something like this, nobody would buy it. And if I'm an engineer, I'm in charge of maintaining this, this is a nightmare. I would be terrified of making any changes to this interface. I'm sure if you're trained on this, this makes a lot of sense. But I can only imagine a new hire being terrified of working with this system or making any changes. Then there are the protocols. So in the IT world, protocols are open standards. Talking to a web server, that's an open standard. FTP, all these things, open standards. Everything operates with each other. Everything is easy to integrate. Great. No, in ICS, you need to pay. You need to pay to get access to some of these protocols. That was very confusing to me. The other thing is that as I started looking at some of these protocols, vulnerabilities in them have existed for years. Years. So for example, this is a Lantronix protocol. This is a very unique protocol. It's very cool. Let's say you forgot your password. Don't worry, Lantronix has you covered. You just ask it. You just send it a packet saying, what's my password? And Lantronix comes back saying, here you go. It's that easy. There is no magic at all. It's just a service that returns your password. It's crazy, and it's been around for a long time. Still not fixed. And the open source stuff that I found was actually very difficult to work with. And I really got to experience that at DEF CON, where I helped at the ICS village. So DEF CON has these villages where people bring, in this case, control systems to let hackers have a look at them and try to break them. And when we exposed these Siemens or whatever, all these different PLCs to the DEF CON crowd, we only had one person even try to write Modbus. It was unsuccessful. And everybody else was just running SQL injection attacks and everything else. They didn't know what they were dealing with. They had no idea how to actually code against it. But it's changing, and I think you guys are realizing that as well. For example, if I look at Stack Overflow, Stack Overflow is sort of the Google for developers. This is a chart of the number of questions that people have been asking about the Modbus protocol. And as you can see, over time, we've seen a drastic increase in the interest in Modbus by regular developers. This is a breakdown of the protocols that people are interested in. Most people are interested in Modbus, followed by BACnet, Siemens S7, and DNP3. So these are the protocols that regular developers are interested in learning more about. And after doing all the work, looking at ICS, figuring out how we should do it the right way, I can tell you that at the moment, I updated this slide this morning, Shodan is seeing 108,490 industrial control systems on the internet. And when you break it down by services that we see in protocols, the majority of what Shodan sees are buildings. So it might be hard to read, but the biggest bar in the left side is Tritium, followed by Modbus, and then Lantronix, and then BACnet. So what Shodan sees are mostly, probably, we're talking about office buildings, things like that. And when you look at the country breakdown, the US is number one. Go US. You do not want to be number one on this list. This isn't a bad list to be number one on. But the US is number one in industrial control systems on the internet, followed by mostly the European countries that you expect, Canada, Taiwan is a bit unusual, and Russia. But what's interesting to me is that certain countries that, for example, China, has a large number of devices on Shodan, webcams, desktops, all these other things. But for ICS, they have very few. And I also threw Kuwait in there, just so you know where you are on the list. And you're very far down. So you have very, very few control systems. I mean, your IP space is also not that big. But you're very far down on the list. But I think China's interesting because they have fewer ICS on the internet than Hungary. And my first observation from starting to look at these results is that we are seeing a trend of people putting the services on non-standard ports. Instead of fixing the problem, they're moving Modbus, which by default is on port 502, they're moving it to 503. Okay, I'm here to tell you this is not an effective security measure. Don't do that. Just secure it to begin with. In terms of growth, however, I can say that it's not catastrophic. So Shodan's been tracking this more seriously probably since 2014, and we are looking at linear growth. So we have not seen a slowdown in the number of devices that are being connected to the internet, ICS devices, but we're not seeing a catastrophic explosion either. This is not the IoT growth rate that we're seeing otherwise. This is ICS, everything moves slowly, so we're seeing linear growth over time. And one reason why, from Shodan's perspective, we have a hard time securing these things and why they keep growing and growing over time is because ICS tends to be connected to networks that are mobile. So in the US, the most common network that we see ICS on is Verizon Wireless. So here I looked at the top organizations for, I believe I looked at OPEC countries for this one. So these are top organizations that we see hosting ICS devices. And it's very difficult for us to know who is behind the device. So we can tell you it's a control system, so we can't tell you is it a critical control system, we can't tell you who owns it. And so actually going after people and making them take it offline is extremely difficult and time-consuming. And we're also facing a lot of education problems. This was taken from the official documentation by Omron. And in case you can't read it, what they're saying is when a router is forwarding a TCP or UDP port to an Omron PLC, the traffic is being delivered to a non-Windows-based operating system. This makes the PLC impenetrable to standard hacking methods. Don't worry, it's not Windows, you're fine. That's basically the message they're sending. This is still live in their documentation, by the way. And this is the introduction to the documentation how to open up your firewall so you can have remote access. This is an official vendor giving out this advice. So we still have some education to fill. And the other thing I'd like to mention is that I briefly said that we already cover IPv6, and we've already seen ICS on IPv6. So don't rely on IPv6 as being any sort of security measure. I really hope that as an industry we can move past security by obscurity and just do it right. And whenever I start talking about the data, maybe not as much nowadays, but I used to get a lot of feedback saying that, hey, how do you know these are real control systems? You know, maybe everything is just a honeypot. Maybe everything on Shodan is just one giant honeypot and, you know, nobody really knows. So I spent some time looking at this. And here's an example banner for Siemens S7, because that's what I looked at initially. And, you know, provides a bunch of information, serial number, PLC name. And what happens when you start breaking down the frequencies for the PLC names, you see Symantec 300, which is not that surprising. But then the second one was Technodrome. Technodrome didn't make a lot of sense. And it turns out that was a honeypot that used defaults. And so I developed a few simple rules for how you can run a honeypot. First, don't put it on Amazon. Don't pretend to be a nuclear power plant in the cloud, okay? It seems pretty straightforward, but you'd be surprised how many people make that mistake. The second one is more obvious. Don't run defaults. Take the 5 minutes to configure it properly. Don't use default serial numbers. This is a person where they changed the PLC name, but they didn't change the serial number. You need to do it the right way. The other thing is you need to do it the right way from the start. If you deploy a honeypot, Shodan indexes it, then you change the defaults later, we see a history in Shodan, and we can see that you were a honeypot 1 month ago. So I don't care what you are right now, but you're still a honeypot, right? Once a honeypot, always a honeypot. And finally, I also did some basic machine learning where I had an idea that I wanted to create an automated tool where I could just feed it like a spam filter. I could feed it a banner, and it would give me back, you know, honeypot, yes or no. And so I used a naive Bayesian algorithm, and it turns out that Technodrome is a pretty good identifier. But what's even better is OEM. OEM sounds really official, and I had no idea that this would be a good indicator, but it turns out that real control systems, or real Siemens S7 devices, they never return that property. They never return information about OEM. This is purely something that was implemented by people that read the spec or reverse engineered it and just decided to fill in every field. So there are other indicators that are better. And finally, I can say, based on what we see right now, and Shodan indexes honeypots and classifies them as such, we see less than 0.5% of the ICS device, or on the ICS devices, potential ICS devices, as honeypots. So very, very few. And this brings me to IoT, which is sort of a hot topic / buzzword / everything nowadays. And IoT has been going crazy. If you haven't seen this yet, you're really missing out. Maybe you're going to get it soon. This is a egg carton. So you're at work, you want to go home, and you really want to have an omelet when you're at home. But you don't know how many eggs you have left. So what do you do? You freak out, right? You need to go to the grocery store, you need to go home first to check eggs. I mean, what are you going to do? I don't know. Don't worry. They have you covered. This is an egg carton. It'll tell you over the iPhone app how many eggs you have left. it's great. So you can just check, and you're like, oh, I only have 2 eggs left. Oh, okay. Time to go to the grocery store. So you can still buy this on Amazon, but the original manufacturer has ceased production because actually it turns out that batteries don't work very well in the refrigerator. So, side note. And yeah, we see everything in the US now has a computer inside its refrigerator that you can tweet from. I don't know why. And this is, I've actually seen this more and more at airports now, where they have a feedback screen in the bathroom. So, how was your experience rated? These are very often running VNC to provide a touch interface. And we see them on Shodan, obviously. And this is, for example, one of my TVs. And whenever I buy a new piece of equipment, I always nmap it to figure out what it's running. And in this case, I'm nmapping it, and as I'm nmapping it, I'm actually launching an update process by accident and opening up the menu. And I started investigating this a bit more, and it turns out these TVs are running a Yahoo SDK, and they kept the debug build, meaning you can have remote access to the TV as if you were a developer. And you can launch updates, you can install apps, you can see everything that is running. And here's a map of it. I've been keeping track of it over the years, just to give you an idea in terms of numbers. For IoT, we're not seeing billions. IPv4 cannot have more than 4 billion. So we're not seeing 20, 30 trillion of these things pop up, but we are seeing an increasing number of them show up on the internet. And one case study that I want to talk about briefly is SmartThings. So SmartThings is a hub for IoT. It runs Telnet, obviously. The reason it runs Telnet is that a developer decided to add it a long time ago, and the developer left the company. And so he was, here's an answer he gave. It's in there for QA, for support purposes. And after he left the company, they decided that they don't understand why it's there, but they're not going to remove it because that's a risk they didn't want to take. So they just kept the port open in their products. And for IoT, especially at security conferences, a lot of people are like, well, I'm not going to buy IoT. I'm going to stay totally off the grid for this. I'm going to unplug it. I'm going to be like, I'm never going to be part of this. You will probably not have a choice. Nowadays, so SmartThings was bought by Samsung, and all the new Samsung TVs include a SmartThings hub. So this whole IoT thing, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to opt out. Extremely difficult. So you should be concerned about the security of it for your own personal gain. And IoT is a bit different. I mean, it's somewhat similar to like ICS in that a lot of people are investing in these infrastructures. And this was also echoed yesterday in many of the talks, where you buy the equipment, but you not factor in the cost of maintaining it and the personnel required to operate it. And so we're seeing this as an example in England. They installed CCTV cameras everywhere. And when there was a budget shortfall, they had to lay off people. But they already paid for the cameras. So they just kept the cameras up and running. And now there's just cameras on the internet with nobody to monitor them or secure them. And this is also more of a tongue-in-cheek thing that happened with IoT. We're starting to see this. It used to be tongue-in-cheek, where a refrigerator was used to send spam, the email kind. But nowadays with Mirai, actually we're seeing more and more people attack these embedded platforms because they're easy. And this is sort of this was an incident, I believe, in Atlanta, an upscale Atlanta area, where somebody put a billboard on the internet. And people found it, and they uploaded a goatse image. Don't Google that. And this is a case where somebody at the corner, you see a police officer, and he just like, what am I supposed to do? This is like this giant obscene image in a billboard, and how do you fix it? He's not equipped. He has never had this problem before. No idea how to fix it. So we're facing a problem now where all of a sudden all these cybersecurity issues are bleeding over into other areas, and they are not equipped to handle them. And for example, in this case, the billboard people, the people that manage the billboard, they just unplugged the computer, and they plugged it back in a week later, and the same thing happened again. And the cycle repeats. And I took a quick look at some of these devices. This is a license plate reader camera. If you pull it up, it's a web server, and on the left side, you see like a real-time view of all the cameras that are driving through the cars that are driving through the intersection, and on the right side, you see the parsed information based from the cameras. And so it's interesting what you can do. I looked at a specific model of these cameras, and it turns out they're mostly deployed in Louisiana. And as I started looking at the protocol, so it's very simple. These cameras are pretty cool. They're on the internet, and all you need to do is send it a hello packet and say, hello, how are you? And it sends back, hey, I'm doing great. You know, here are all my pictures. Here are all my pictures from the camera. And until you say stop, it'll keep sending you images of all the license plates it finds, all the cars that are driving through it. There's no authentication and nothing, right? It's just very simple service. And more importantly, in the data feed that it sends you of images, the images actually contain the license plate itself. So you don't need to do any parsing. All the parsing it does is encoded in the image itself, which makes life very easy, and which made it possible for me to build my own license plate database. So here is, I just built a simple web interface. I don't think it's running right now, but there are a lot of things possible nowadays with IoT, with ICS that's connected to the internet. It's not just security problems. I mean, in this case, the study I did here, I looked at 100 cameras for 5 days, and I got some 60,000 unique license plates. What I thought was really cool is that, yes, there are giant security problems, giant privacy problems, but some of the things you could do with the data, and I think that appeals to somewhat why the businesses want to do this, is you can analyze, for example, in this case, I started breaking down who has vanity license plates. So I could say that 1.3% of the people in Louisiana have vanity license plates. I can empirically measure that. So this project is dead, by the way. Everything was reported to the EFF, and it turns out these cameras were installed by law enforcement that were trying out this new system, new technology, and they didn't understand that they had misconfigured them. They didn't realize that if you can access it over the internet, so can everybody else. And there are a lot of things you can do nowadays with the data that is readily available on the internet. In this case, I am showing you which devices need their toner replaced. So you can measure that. You can just go on the internet and be like, who needs a new printer toner? Who needs to have their paper replaced, right? And for the ICS people, you can also look at the wind turbines on the internet, and you can ask them, well, how much power are you producing? How large are you? How many turbines do you have installed? All these different things. You can measure it. So I think that speaks to, I think, the business case around all the new connectivity requirements that people have for ICS and IoT. It's this vision of, from a business perspective, what you can provide. And there's no way we can deny that. There's no way as security people we can go, you can't have this. Because it's so powerful, it saves a lot of money, it's unprecedented insight that you gain from this data set. And, all right, I don't know why. The final slide I wanted to show you is that for all the research that we've been doing into ICS and IoT, we've had less than 10 people email us. Can I go down? We've had less than 10 people email us and ask us, hey, why are you trying to contact my control system? Why are you doing these things? So from our perspective, there seems to be very little visibility, very little network monitoring being performed by OT. So I don't know whether it's not on the radar, but we are not seeing a lot of, at least, network security monitoring from our perspective. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
We have time for half a question. It needs to be a very, very well put together question. So if we can have your name, your company, and your question, please. Raise your hand so that a microphone can come to you. And if there are no bidders, in 3, 2, 1, I'm taking the time myself. So can you tell me and the audience, when you're doing your interesting internet stuff. Where are you finding the biggest challenge in cybersecurity? What area is the biggest challenge of breach data?
Of breach data or general security? I mean, one reason I go to these ICS-related conferences is because I do consider it one of the largest problems that we see on Shodan. So because everybody realizes these are potentially important systems, but we're seeing an increase. I've been doing this for a few years now, and we've been very ineffective at actually reducing the numbers.
And actually, to add on to what you were saying, it's not just an increase, it's a massive increase by the year. I saw 2015, 16, and 17, and there was a massive increase, right?
Sizable, yeah. I wouldn't. It's not.
I saw some data where it was 250 in 2015, and then you had jumped to 2,000.
Oh, that was for the smart TVs. Yes, that was a bit different.
Ah,
yes.
okay.
For
so
ICS, we're seeing very linear growth, which I think makes sense given the industry's slow-moving everything. But yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause. Shodan founder, John Matherly.
Thank you.